Professor Adam Wells is here to present a paper which he has written with Professor James Darcy, and the title of their joint paper is Walking in the Steps of Pope John the 23rd, Martin Luther King Jr. and Oscar Romero.
Well, first I should thank the organizers. I'm really grateful to be included in this event, and I also want to bring greetings from my colleague Jim Darcy, who hates to miss this wonderful event. Our paper tracks a trajectory of peace building through Pope John the 23rd, Martin Luther King, and Oscar Romero. So I'll start with Pope John the 23rd. When it was first published during the course of the Second Vatican Council 52 years ago, Pope John the 23rd's encyclical Pacem in Terris broke new ground in the attempt to build universal peace. While previous social encyclicals had been directed to the venerable brethren and faithful of the Catholic world, Pacem in Terris was addressed to all men of goodwill. Pacem in Terris was not intended for Christian in-house discussion only, because peace is everyone's concern. Also, the encyclical was groundbreaking in insisting on a goal much greater than a simple absence of war. Rather, the goal must be a deep and abiding peace on earth. Not only that, but Pacem in Terris affirmed that envisioning and describing such a peace is not enough. It's just a first step. Peace building must be active. It's an activity, one in which individuals and states must make choices. Our own actions and those actions of our governments can lead to continuing the status quo, or to more enmity among us and our neighbors, or to greater peace. If true peace is to come, it's going to be by trudging forward, step by step. John the 23rd claimed that peace was contingent on individuals and nations relating to one another as God intended. There was a social order established by the Creator, and it was a moral order. It was an order that we can perceive in progress and change through reason and science. And this order of creation was knowable to everyone, Christian and non-Christians alike, through, John thought, natural law. That is to say, the human conscience revealed the Creator's intended moral social order to women and men and urged us all to obey it. If structuring society as God intended, people and nations would be marked by justice, goodwill, charity, trust, freedom, and the world would know true peace. John the 23rd listed human rights that accompanied creation. John's list wasn't meant to be comprehensive, but instead he offered examples. In other words, the encyclical gave insight into the types of rights that characterize human life when it's operating the way that it should. The rights John the 23rd listed, including the right to preserve and develop life, the right to an education, the right to be respected, the right to freedom, the right to worship, the right to support when raising a family, the right to work, the right to ownership of property, the right to association, the right to travel, and the right to participate in public life. But the freedom of one individual sometimes infringes upon the freedom of another. So most helpful to our thinking, John the 23rd's encyclical also reminds us of how each of these rights has to be accompanied by corresponding duties. Individual rights walk hand in hand with corresponding obligations when building universal peace. Quote, one man's natural right gives rise to a corresponding duty in other men, the duty that is of recognizing and respecting that right. The most important of these duties, according to Pacem in Terris, was the golden rule, respecting the other. And the state plays an important role here. Defense of an individual's rights cannot justify oppression, for instance, or the inaction of the state against a clear injustice. The rights of minority populations must be protected by the state. Also, states face obligations towards other states, such as not pursuing their own development at the expense of injuring or oppressing others. Again, the overarching duty was respecting the other. Pacem in Terris connected human rights with individual obligations in a manner that was comfortable not only to Roman Catholics, but to Protestants as well. And in that regard, it was thoroughly ecumenical. At the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the great Martin Luther framed the double affirmation of individual liberty and duty with these words: a Christian man is perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to no one else. And a Christian man is perfectly free, servant of all, subject to everyone. The affirmation of radical freedom and radical responsibility to neighbor and community that we encounter in Pacem in Terris and Luther, of course, has been the hallmark of Morehouse College. From its inception, Morehouse held that all men were equal in that they were created equal. For Morehouse, that people were created in the image of God indicated a connection joining our rational minds, and especially our ability to love, to God himself. And that humans were created in the likeness of God indicated that we could develop our minds, grow in love, and generally progress on our pilgrimage to heaven and in this life. But is this appeal to men and women of goodwill enough? Is persuasion enough? We certainly applaud how Pacem in Terris answered Jesus' command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind by asking that we invest ourselves in others and in the world, in peace building, that is. The business world, the home, the schoolhouse are all proper places to glorify God. Christians and all people of goodwill are to engage their powers in labors towards peace on earth. But how exactly are we to bring about such conditions of true peace? How do we build a society marked not only by the absence of war, but by justice, by people who enjoy a full range of human rights and who assume corresponding duties, a society with less poverty, more education, greater economic equality, and a more equitable distribution of goods between individuals and nations? Here's where the prescriptions of Pacem in Terris fall short, in our view. While the encyclical tremendously affected Catholic social teaching in a variety of ways, it's not clear that in itself it has moved our world much closer to the enduring vision of peace, the enduring peace visualized by the pontiff. Critics sometimes point to John's idealized vision of individuals and community. Of greater concern, however, are the encyclical's suggestions, or lack thereof, for changing the structures of society to bring about this better community. After offering a few concrete recommendations, Pacem in Terris falls back on the persuasive voice of the church to bring about change. Like Luther and so much of Christian moral theology, John the 23rd falls back on the prescription of conversion, converting individuals, men and women of goodwill, to a new course of action. John eschews force, and especially violence of any kind, but can nonviolent persuasion be effective in building a just society and in producing true peace? When in December 1964 at Oslo, Morehouse's most famous graduate, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he sounded much of the optimism for true peace voiced by Pope John the 23rd. Sooner or later, he said, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Violence was no answer, he claimed, for while sometimes momentarily successful, violence never brings lasting peace. In fact, he says, civilization and violence are antithetical concepts. Dr. King's answer was love, a love that rejects revenge, physical aggression, and retaliation. As we all know, Dr. King termed his alternative for building peace nonviolent resistance. While being physically passive, the method was both active and aggressive spiritually. King wasn't asking politely for black equality. Nonviolent resistance asserted aggressively the rights and duties that were also enumerated in John's encyclical in order to ultimately effect justice. Quote, we cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. With characteristic humility, Dr. King credited the method of nonviolent resistance to India's great liberator, Mohandas Gandhi, giving credit also to Morehouse's own Benjamin Elijah Mays for introducing him to it. But as there was something borrowed about Dr. King's method of nonviolent resistance, there was also much new about it. Dr. King left us with a description of his approach in his article, The Current Crisis in Race Relations. He stresses 5 facts. First, the method actively resists evil. It's not cowardly and it's not passive. Second, the goal of nonviolent resistance is redemption, reconciliation, and the creation of a loving community. Third, the method seeks to defeat evil rather than persons. Fourth, nonviolent resistance not only avoids physical violence, but avoids what King called violence of the spirit. So he opposed hate campaigns or temptations to become bitter. And fifth, the resistor can accept suffering without retaliation because the creative forces of the universe are on the side of justice. And in the final analysis, it's justice that will win out. To put it in theological terms, Dr. King was concerned with structural sin. Sin is what dehumanizes us, making us different than what the Creator intended. Sin cuts us off from God and thus from other people. So while Dr. King was concerned with individual sin, he was most concerned with those structures or building blocks of society that bring about injustice or allow it to happen. Again, in theological terms, society's laws, justice systems, banking regulations, economic organizations, wage and labor policies can all be demonic in the sense that they can all bring about injustice, which is fundamentally dehumanizing. Even more than individual sin, perhaps, unjust structures are the cause of mass suffering. The sins are often hidden, and even perpetrated by the very men and women of goodwill to whom John the 23rd addressed his encyclical. Because they often are hidden behind unrecognized privilege and good intentions, structural sins are harder to address than individual ones. And the church itself sometimes participates unknowingly in these sinful structures. In sum, while Dr. King joined John the 23rd in saying that true peace would come when individuals and nations fully committed themselves to human rights, not only by affirming them, but also by accepting the responsibilities that accompany liberty, he pushed beyond the pontiff by offering concrete steps for changing unjust social structures. Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, his activities raising awareness of how African Americans were treated, about America's war in Vietnam, about the great divide in our society of rich and poor, and his appeal to the courts and legislative bodies for fair treatment for all changed the social landscape of America. Dr. King's program of resistance prevailed over time in the civil rights movement, but couldn't we argue that it succeeded in America precisely because our nation was founded on an ideal of equality before the law? Isn't this a pattern peculiar to liberal societies such as our own? And further, isn't it fairly easy to imagine situations where the laws and their enforcement and public opinion are so controlled by purveyors of violence that Dr. King's approach might not work? Would it work, for instance, in Hitler's Germany, in Stalin's Soviet Union, in Kim Jong-un's North Korea? Would it work with ISIS? We think it would. And the biography of San Salvador's Archbishop Romero helps us understand why. The outline of Romero's story is well known. A professorial bishop who in 1977 was thrust against his own wishes into a position of confrontation with a brutally repressive government, becoming the voice of the voiceless until assassinated in 1980. Like the great 16th century defender of Native Americans, Bartolomé de las Casas, Romero found it necessary to appeal to a court that transcended local borders. As Las Casas had written about the devastation of the Indies and taken his defense of the Indians to King Charles V, Romero addressed universities, Georgetown and Louvain in particular, the National Council of Churches in New York, even President Jimmy Carter. The motivation was similar. Rogue states depend on the acquiescence of others when perpetrating atrocities. So to redress injustices in El Salvador, Romero urged President Carter to shut off military aid to the Salvadoran government. He appealed to Carter as a Christian and a defender of human rights to guarantee that America would not intervene directly or indirectly with military, economic, diplomatic, or other pressures in determining the destiny of the Salvadoran people. Following the footsteps of Pachaminteras and Martin Luther King Jr., Romero argued that the universe moves on the side of justice. Romero was assassinated in 1980 while celebrating Mass remembering the death of the mother of the publisher of El Independiente, one of the few remaining voices of justice and human rights in his country. From there, the government's violence escalated to the point that the government murdered approximately another 16,000 civilians the next year. In all, La Matanza led to the massacre of 75,000 people and the displacement of close to 20% of El Salvador's population. The homily he preached when he was killed is eerily reminiscent of King's last speech in Memphis. on April 3rd, 1968, and I'd like to quote it here. "We know that every effort to better society, especially when injustice and sin are so ingrained, is an effort that God blesses, that God wants, that God demands of us. We remember with gratitude this generous woman who was able to sympathize with all who work for a better world and who added her own grain of wheat through her suffering. We know that no one can go on forever, but those who have put into their work a sense of very great faith, of love of God, of hope among human beings, find it all results in the splendors of a crown that is the sure reward of those who labor thus, cultivating truth, justice, love, and goodness on earth. Let us join together then intimately in faith and hope at this moment of prayer for Dona Sarita and ourselves." While he spoke this last phrase, Oscar Romero was killed. He died in solidarity with Christ and all those who suffered to build peace. Thank you.